Welcome to what is actually a bit of an embarrassing first, really, for Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. Possibly, I suppose, considering the strength of the Institute's Environment and Society program, but also, I guess, because our program has been more traditionally security orientated, and we've never really had a roundtable on this topic. Quite an astonishing lapse on my part, especially. And considering, I suppose, that the topic of climate change is at least as much political as it is environmental. Still, today is the first step in making up for it, and the timing, of course, is no coincidence with COP26 around the corner. Although, really, for some years now, I have heard repeatedly from Western diplomats and the Russia commentariat, I should say, that the all of humanity challenge of climate change is one of a few areas that we can cooperate with Russia, considering the enmity between Russia and the West over so many things, I'm sorry to say. And that at least makes sense in theory, considering the science and considering the urgency. In practice, for what it's worth, which is very little at all, and I actually have my doubts about that, but that's what we need to explore over the next 85 minutes. And to do that, we first need to hear the Russian view, both officially and with the tremendous background that Dr. Vladimir Debrensov provides. He's chief advisor to the Director General of the Russian Energy Agency, based, of course, within the Ministry of Energy, but has so much experience beyond that, not least in the World Bank and for BP. Speaking directly after Vladimir will be my former colleague, actually, at Chatham House, Anna Korpu, now research professor at the Fridtjof Nansens Institute in Norway, but actually speaking from Tampere. Anna looks at green growth in the Arctic, the Russian coal sector, and honestly, the very topic we're discussing today. So nice to have you back in some ways, in every way, Anna. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. But that's really all for me to say, other than the fact that we're on the record. We're being recorded today. This video will go up, if it's any good, in the next few days. And I will invite you all in time to submit your questions, either orally by putting an electronic hand up, or obviously with the chat, and I'm happy to read them out either way. But over to you, Vladimir, for 10 to 15 minutes. It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you very much indeed. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, James. I would start with admitting that if we had this conversation about a year ago, I mean, just a year ago, you would have heard a completely different story from my side. Because what I see happening in this country over the course of this year, actually, amounts to, I wouldn't call it even evolution of the approach. In my view, it's a revolution in the approach to climate on the Russian side. Because if we had this workshop in October 2020, the only government document which would be addressing climate change and energy transition issues would be a Russian energy strategy to 2035, which was approved by the government of Russia in June last year. But if any of you have looked at this document, you would agree that basically the energy transition is mentioned only in passing there. It's a completely old style, I mean, Gosplan document on developing production of hydrocarbons in this country. But then things have started to change very fast. Already in November 2020, so I mean, just less than a year ago, the president of this country issued a decree number 666, which of course, the number caused a lot of comments in the media in this country. But anyway, that was the decree on actually reducing GHG, greenhouse gases emission in this country. Of course, at that time, this reduction was relative to 1990 and was consistent with Russia's pledge under the Paris Agreement. So basically, the decree said that Russia would emit only 70% of greenhouses it emitted back in 1990, which actually, and it was clear to everybody, meant that Russia would increase emissions, because at the moment, Russia is at the level around or below 50% of the 1990 level. But one important thing, which was also part of this decree number 666, was an instruction to the government to develop a low carbon strategy to 2050. And I think that sort of kick-started the process. Of course, there was a pretty important influence from outside of this country coming into the game later, which was the EU Commission, by approving the Green Deal and CBAM, which of course has raised a lot of concerns on the part of the Russian government, and I think greatly accelerated progress that we've seen on this front. But anyway, so coming to this year, already in the speech to the Federal Assembly last May, the president of this country put a new target for greenhouse emissions, which was to have cumulative emissions by the year 2050 lower than cumulative emissions by the European Union, which of course actually, given that the EU targeted carbon neutrality by 2050, meant that Russia was starting to think about reducing Russian emissions. And also in this speech at the Federal Assembly, President mentioned support to developing nuclear, which is considered clean energy in this country, hydrogen, and renewables. And pretty soon after that, in July this year, the government suggested and the parliament approved the law on limiting GHG emissions in this country. It was, as I said, July 2021. And this law envisages carbon reporting. So all emitters with emissions above 150,000 tons of CO2 equivalent should report their emissions to the government beginning 2023. And after 2025, this threshold is reduced to 50,000 carbon CO2 equivalent emissions. So basically, again, if the government would not be thinking about doing something with carbon, there was no sense in this law. But that was just, again, the real start of some regulatory developments for addressing energy transition. And what was also in this law, there were criteria, clear criteria for climate projects, which were made part of this law, and also the law talked about regulations for carbon unit trading. So again, this law sort of set the basis for introducing either carbon taxes or carbon trading in Russia. And in parallel, the government was working on hydrogen strategy. In August this year, the government issued the roadmap for hydrogen industry. And as you perhaps heard, Russia targets, and it's mentioned by everybody and all the time, Russia targets up to 20% of the global hydrogen market. So in simple terms, Russia sees hydrogen as at least partial substitutions for hydrocarbons in terms of what it can offer to the world and international market. And I think the most important change, which is not public yet, but which we will likely see by the end of this week, is the government low carbon strategy. I mean, the one which the president instructed the government to develop back in November last year. So that's a long saga. I guess some PhD students might even write a thesis on how this low carbon strategy evolved over the course of this year, because the version which will likely be approved by the government is the third version. And I have to tell you that I mean, each consecutive version was dramatically different from the previous one, and all of them are actually going to sort of tackling carbon emission reduction in earnest. So basically, in the current version, and you'll see it, as I say, in a matter of days, or I hope that you'll see it, the government has just two scenarios. One is called target scenario or intensive scenario, and it basically envisages increase in emissions in this country only by not 6% by 2030, and this is not relative to 1990, of course, this is to the current level, and then reduction by 79% by 2050. And by 2060, Russia promises to reach carbon neutrality, similar to China. So that's basically a tremendous change from what I said we saw only a year ago, when Russia was talking about sort of keeping increases in carbon emissions as the basic scenario. And for comparison, this strategy also has sort of inertia, business as usual scenario, which says that if not for the measures that the government now plans, emissions in this country would have grown by 25% by 2050. So again, all this tells to me that the road to reaching carbon neutrality is long, but at least Russia has already stepped on it. And I think, again, if it gets translated, or if any of you reads Russian, I would advise you to look at a recent interview by First Deputy Prime Minister, Andrei Belousov. He gave this interview about a week ago on October 18th. And that's a clear message that the government will be tackling energy transition seriously. I mean, to start with some quotations, Andrei says that humankind has not developed any other answer to climate change but energy transition. Again, that's something which people high in the Russian government would rather not say just a year ago. And also this, in his interview, he mentions how Russia will work on technologies, not just hydrogen, on clean technologies, on that. Actually, in this interview, he admits that the role of CBAM, because he says, you know, it's better to invest in Russia, in reducing carbon emissions in Russia, than to pay to the EU budget for exporting to Europe some high carbon footprint products. And given that my time expires, I would mention just one thing last but not least. What happened just about a month ago, in my interpretation, is a very important change in this country. Because regulation is one thing, real business is another. And what happened a month ago in September was that at the auction for financial support to build a new capacity, new generating capacity in Russia, renewables, or more specifically wind generators, offered lower price than the wholesale one, which means that basically Russian renewables are becoming cheaper than traditional generation, and that's as far as I'm concerned, and I'm an economist, is the crucial change in this country. And basically they said that they would develop new capacity at just 40% of cost of developing CCGT, which is the best low carbon hydrocarbon technology for generating electricity. So again, just as initial remarks, this is my take on what happened in this country, both in terms of government regulation and real business, just in a matter of less than a year.
Vladimir, thank you very much indeed. You've made a strong case for a revolutionary change in Russia, and I hope we'll get into that in the questions and discussion. And you say just now that regulation is one thing and business is another. I mean, perhaps we might also say that legislation is one thing and enforcement or inaction is another. But we'll get into that perhaps in the discussion. I've got lots of questions, but it makes a lot more sense, and it would be much more erudite and informed if Anna Korpu did that with her own presentation and perhaps in response as well. So Anna, welcome again, and over to you.
So many thanks, Vladimir, for your presentation. Very interesting and encouraging, I must say. There has been a great change of rhetoric, as you said, over the last year, and it's kind of happening faster over the last months. But since I've been studying this topic, Russian climate policy, its implementation, and Russia's role in international climate diplomacy for the last 2 decades, I will take a bit sort of longer background view in my presentation. So let's first briefly look at the overview of Russia's climate policy so far. As also Vladimir was indicating, the previous targets have indeed been emission growth targets, or business as usual, if you like, and comparison year has been 1990. So I would say that the Kyoto Protocol took an unlimited economic growth target for Russia, whereas the Paris Agreement somewhat limited the growth, but still allowed growth. And of course, it was the Soviet emission decline, the post-Soviet emission decline in the early 90s that allowed this, not real focused carbon reduction policies. Another important element that has been there over the last 20 years is the role of Russian forests and the forest sink offsets. Also going a bit further back than Vladimir had time maybe to go, is to recognize that over the last decade, indeed a portfolio of policy measures has been adopted in Russia on energy efficiency, renewable energy, associated petroleum and gas flaring, best available technology, and all these policies, while not really driven by climate mitigation ambitions, they have a potential to reduce emissions also in terms of the global climate. But here we should also think about the focus of the policies. So which sectors of the economy do they focus on? Do they focus on the main emitting sectors, and whether the policies have actually been implemented? And I will come back to this issue, but in reality, there's been very little impact on Russia's greenhouse gas emissions by this project or this portfolio of different policies. And it's kind of natural. Russia's economy is dependent on the fossil fuel sector. And so, of course, this would naturally direct domestic policy and thinking. And there are very strong interest groups there, then putting forward these points, also, of course, in the political leadership. And therefore, I would say that has there been a change in this kind of basic, big sort of parts of Russian climate policy over the last decades? Then I would say in terms of individual policies, yes, there have been more policies launched, but in terms of the ambition of commitments and implementation of policies, no, not really. And it was really exciting to hear Vladimir's presentation about the latest developments, and looks and sounds indeed very encouraging, but all that would, of course, it's still on statement level, and it will require much further development in order to develop policies on the sectors which are the main emitters, and then implementing those policies, which has been a challenge for Russia. so Russian sort of wider Russian approaches to climate policy so far, and I'm talking about the longer period, not necessarily what hopefully is really happening now. Now we've seen the rhetoric, and hopefully we'll see also action. But yeah, Russia has really very much been focusing on financial flows and Russia's own image in international climate policy during the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and has been avoiding economically and politically negative consequences as seen by the Russian stakeholders from those agreements. And also costly climate policies, which would generate globally shared environmental benefits, they haven't really been seen to fit the Russian approach to international environmental agreements. Policies have mostly been seen as acceptable if they don't really lead into major costs. And that is kind of explained by the whole environmental policy in Russia. It's not quite as developed as in most European countries. So these things are coming somewhat as new elements in the Russian economy. And the climate question has been largely conceptualized as an economic or foreign policy issue rather than an environmental policy issue. Environmental policy is often in Russia conceptualized as something which has to do with local pollution and people's health. Understandably, if we had that situation here, we might well do the same. But this kind of provides background on why the global environmental issue of climate change hasn't become quite as prominent as it has done, for instance, in the EU and in Europe. Shouldn't just say EU now that we are speaking in the UK platform now. But yeah, so most of these other issues than greenhouse gas emission reductions that really drive these policies, which can be labeled also as climate policies, and they can be economical, political, foreign policy. I mentioned a few already. And an interesting element has been that such economic and political interests have maybe been seen as the expected driver of climate policies of also other countries rather than environmental concerns. There was quite a lot of discussion whether the EU is launching CBAM as some kind of green protectionism kind of vehicle, if you like, in Russia. And hopefully that discussion is getting forward now. There are Russian stakeholders also who are saying that this is not the case, but it's been like the kind of natural way of looking at this since maybe the climate issue is not the most prominent driver of policy. Also, the process of climate policy, one might argue, is important, and sometimes in Russia is more important than the actual results, actually delivering emission reductions. There's also often lack of data on policy results. Russia is not alone with this issue. Of course, many other countries also are having trouble verifying their policies. For instance, in Finland now we have the government discussing when to review the current climate policy and whether it's been delivering what it should. So Russia is not alone with this by any means. I should also finally mention this, the anthropogenic or natural origin of climate change, this discussion, or both. So that has been a major element over the last 2 decades in Russian climate policy. And now maybe partly also commenting on what Vladimir was saying about this carbon neutrality target. And I had a question mark there. This has been a statement by the president, and we haven't seen this in any legal documents yet. There, I would say that one should pay attention to the role of forest sinks. How important would they be? And also would be very interested in Vladimir's view on this and how much information you have about this, what the role of forest sinks is considered to be in achieving carbon neutrality. Because the IPCC approved methodology, it does illustrate that the anthropogenic sink, which is land use change, and forestry activities by people, it's been declining in Russia for the last 10 years. This can be seen clearly in the UNFCCC inventory, greenhouse gas inventory data. that Russia itself is delivering to the UN. And there's been some discussions about recalculating the Russian forest carbon sink, and there one would have to consider whether such recalculation they might well be a good ground for some revision of data. I hear that some of the data is not the best quality at the moment, but at the same time, it's not, the idea is not to calculate all the sinks of the Russian forest, but just those that people are causing and enhancing, and those changes. Also, I'm very interested in hearing kind of what domestic sectors would be addressed by the policies that are required in order to implement such a carbon neutrality target, because the previous policies really have focused on fairly minor sectors rather than the fossil fuel and industry sectors. So that's something to look at. Vladimir was listing things like there's hydrogen economy, very interesting indeed, but just by hydrogen economy, of course, that might be a new business for Russia. And it would be interesting if Russia went for that. But at the same time, of course, the emissions would have to come down in the industrial sector. And the definition of the complexity of policy measures is another issue. Is there going to be a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme? Or are just individual sectoral policies? Kind of a carbon tax would be more overall and maybe simpler policy than this kind of fairly difficult nitty-gritty policies per sector, which have not always worked in Russia. And the previously mentioned CBAM, I want to bring that up as a potential driver of this and help for Russia. Because indeed, if Russia would prefer paying, the companies paying to the Russian government rather than to the EU, it would make sense to have a domestic carbon tax. So is CBAM really a driver? Is it a friend for Russia? Is it pushing Russia to do something that is good for the Russian economy rather than a foe, as some Russian commentators have at some point considered it? Then the deadlines and reviews of the success of policy implementation, as I mentioned, that's very important. That has often been lacking in Russia, as it has been lacking in many other countries. Data availability has been a problem, for instance, on the associated petroleum gas flaring policy, which looks very good. It is very difficult to tell what the results actually have been and what has been included in the data and what's not. And then, of course, the plans on the fossil fuel exports and economic diversification in order to decarbonize the Russian economy, they are the key. There are also elements that are coming from outside in order to, which might reduce such sectoral activities in Russia, because if there's no more or less demand for Russian fossil fuels starting from coal, there would of course be less supply from Russia. And this is my last and concluding slide. So thinking about then Western cooperation with Russia, I must say that what has been said now and what the rhetoric says now, there is a change there, and that's very encouraging. But one shouldn't still completely forget the previous experiences, and I'm sure policymakers in other countries are not going to forget it. There will be caution towards the Russian rhetoric. So in a way, there are various elements that one should consider before approaching Russia on this matter. So how to communicate the concern about global climate as a motivation for costly policy to the Russian stakeholders. It's not so simple that climate change is obviously considered as a good reason to pay for environmental policy. And the gains that Russia would get from international climate policy, they have been in the picture very strongly previously. So the question is that still expected? Is the West willing to provide that kind of benefits against potentially very low impact policies, if that is what Russia is still after? The EU has already gone, if you like, from a carrot to a stick. They have set up a CBAM, which just charges for the carbon content. The EU has worked very long time to get Russia to cooperate on climate. And I think one reason for CBAM is that Russia and some other countries maybe have not cooperated quite as much as the EU internal carbon market would require. And then important question is who to cooperate with in Russia. Is it the government or is it the private sector? Russian companies will, of course, be motivated by CBAM to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And also just in general, importers of Russian products might have further environmental requirements. So that's a major element. But what is going to be the role of the Russian government? The international pressure is the thing that keeps Russian climate policy going, so it's very important. And therefore, it would be also very interesting to hear what the UK view on this is, now that the UK is not part of the EU anymore. It's kind of, the EU has had some communication problems with Russia, to put it in a nice way. But I mean, does it really help the UK that the UK would now go on its own, alone to Moscow? Maybe more freedom, but what kind of cooperation could the UK do with Russia on climate? And is there a danger that if the UK will want to bring Russia along, would Russia still expect some of these kind of old-fashioned gains or some sort of low-hanging fruits against such cooperation? That would be interesting to hear from our UK colleagues as well. I'll leave this here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. I can't help but think just on your last comment that that the UK obviously has some communications problems with Russia as well. So that we may not be any better off in that respect, but maybe we can get into that. We'll see. Ladies and gents, I'm very desperate to get to the questions, and I've already seen 3 or 4 excellent ones in the chat, which I will definitely come to. But I did promise Vladimir when we were speaking over the weekend that I would offer him a chance to respond to Anna. I know you could go backwards and forwards like that forever, but I think it's very reasonable in this case. And I suppose, Vladimir, to give you an entree, then the upshot of much of what Anna was saying is that there is the rhetoric, and that's very encouraging. It's super, it's different, it's revolutionary, as you say yourself. But there's some skepticism about the reality, about action, implementation, enforcement, whatever you like. So I guess that's where the challenge is coming from, if you like. But over to you, Vladimir, briefly, if I may.
Thank you, James. I just would like to comment on a few points made by Anna. Starting with rhetoric versus real change. You know, of course, I completely agree that implementation, that's the only thing which matters. But just sharing my own experience, I've been working with this government from mid-90s, first at the World Bank and then at BP. And I think I've learned how to distinguish rhetoric from some real effort. And what I see now looks more like a real effort than just rhetoric. I happen to be on one of 9 working groups established by the government to address climate issues. I mean, one of them have already become formal, the hydrogen one, but there are 8 others, and I'm on the one which title is Energy Sector Transformation. And I mean, being part of this group, I see a lot of government officials. And again, I can only repeat what I have mentioned in the very beginning of my presentation. I hear completely different views. I see completely different actions by people who just several years ago would not bother even to talk about climate issues. Or if they talked about them, their approach would be completely negative. So again, I can mention just a few things that have always been discussed with the government, but had no progress, like reform of the gas sector or eliminating cross subsidies, particularly in energy. What I see now is completely different from what I've seen attempts by people to sort of introduce these topics into the government agenda. You've mentioned that there is no sort of public or government document which targets carbon neutrality by 2060. That's not fully correct. If you look at these versions of the Russian low carbon strategy, and they're public, I mean, 2 previous ones. I said that the 3rd one we'll see as a proof document later this week. But anyway, so you would see 2060 in intensive scenario as a target for this country, and you'll see it in the approved document, I believe. And this approved document would also have targets for sector reduction. You've mentioned this, Anna, that who knows what this envisages. it is still true that Russia is very keen on increasing carbon sink by ecological systems, forests and agriculture and others. But you mentioned, yeah, I mean, that's not just an attempt to recalculate something. That's, again, I see as sort of a real agenda for instance, reducing fires in Russian, I mean, forest fires. So there are some things that the government would like to take on this front. And also, again, if you look at Belarus's interview or at this low carbon strategy, you will see carbon taxes and carbon price. And the government at the moment discusses 4 options for this. But actually, Andrei Belousov, to repeat, his first deputy prime minister of this country, said that it will take just 1-2 years to test this. And so in 2 years, at max, this country will have some type of carbon price or carbon tax. So again, I mean, that's a tremendous change relative to 14 years of history of addressing climate issues, which you described. Lastly, I would mention Russia's attitude and government attitude to CBAM and actually Russian companies' attitude. Again, if you look at Russian big names in or among Russian majors like Lukoil, Rosneft, Gazprom Neft, you find carbon reduction targets in all their programs. By now, they all, I mean, similar to their peers in the West, they all target some reduction. Again, I'm not saying that there is no room for improving what they target, but they already started that. And again, it started about a year ago, in some cases, like a year and a half. And also now what I hear in discussions within the government is that perhaps CBAM will benefit Russia. Because if one looks at investment made by Russian exporters in metal sector and some others, actually their energy efficiency beats energy efficiency on the Western, on European front. So they say, if the European Commission gets rid of free quotas, we might become more competitive than our peers in Europe. So again, now I hear more and more that people see CBAM and actually energy transition not as a challenge, but as an opportunity to further modernize Russian economy. That's what I wanted to mention in this remark.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, again, once more. That's fascinating. And again, your optimism knows no bounds, but I think, you know, there's probably still some digging in to go into some of the
James, I think I see some familiar names. Like of course.
Yeah, I know. I can see them as well.
Usually, I'm not an optimist.
Fair enough. No, it makes sense. Listen, I'm sure you can see familiar names. So can I. I'm going to go to the questions, of course. Possibly not in order, but I will get to them. Michael Bradshaw's first on my list, which is arbitrary. So Michael is asking, will Russia be willing to forego the future development of fossil fuels in the Arctic, onshore and offshore, as suggested by the IEA's net zero scenario? Can I go to you, Vladimir, first, and then to Anna for that?
A frank answer is not at the moment, but I think that we might see some changes on this front a little bit later. I mean, in say 3-5 years.
Would you agree with that, Anna? Makes sense.
Yes, what I've been studying on, in general, how the Arctic is seen in Russia's environmental policies, it's rarely brought up in the Russian documents as such a special case that we might think in the West. I've been very surprised. For instance, when one discusses a green economy, Arctic element doesn't really come up. So I'll just leave it there. I don't know more about these energy projects either.
Understood. Okay, we'll go to Aditya Parikh, please, who I think is at a research institute in India. I may have that wrong, Aditya. I'm sorry if I do, but Aditya's got a 2-part question, and I'll certainly take the first one first. What kind of measures are Russia and China taking bilaterally to tackle climate change? Whilst there's been mention of the issue being discussed between Russian and Chinese foreign ministers, he says, and between the leaders, is there anything more substantial than, again, just a rhetoric? Again, Vladimir first, if I may, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm not aware of any serious efforts made in this area. I think it is possible, but basically, to tell you the truth, that China's attitude towards climate change came as a surprise to Russia. I mean, I'm making a lot of presentations on what energy transition is about in various audiences, central bank, government. And I mean, most people who hear about these issues for the first time, they all think about the EU. They never thought about Russia, and I have to tell them, you have to look at China and what China tries to do on energy transition and what geopolitical issues this country wants to solve by approaching energy transition faster than many other countries. And just shown that simple tables that China it got prepared to energy transition. It controls over 60% of wind capacity, or production for wind capacity, solar capacity, lithium batteries, all crucial metals for energy transition. Basically, are controlled by China from 40 to 80%. And I mean, they're completely surprised. And I think when they realize that China is changing, that was another contribution to changing their mind. But again, in terms of bilateral cooperation, I haven't seen much progress so far. I think it was also part of this question, the talk about Sakhalin.
Yeah, sure.
Here. Let me just mention, I was there last year and talked to the governor. And I mean, that might be an interesting story to find out how he came to that. But I can tell you that he is serious, and the government by now is serious. It has become one of 3 main pilot areas for actually real carbon trading and hydrogen development. Because, for instance, all railroads, by decree of the governor, will be made hydrogen in a few years. So let's see what progress they will have. But again, it's not rhetoric. I see some investment going in there. So I think that it's interesting to follow up what really happens there, but it is for real.
Great, thanks, Vladimir. Anna, anything on Russia-China cooperation? Yeah. And obviously, Vladimir's beaten me to it on the Sakhalin and Kuril question.
Very briefly, I don't think there is any sort of actual government level cooperation between China and Russia on climate so far. Hope that would be very useful, but there's been some business level activity. There are Chinese companies active in the Russian sort of renewable energy, solar energy sector, so they're quite influential there. That's the only one I come across. About Sakhalin, one should also remember that coal mining is kept as one of the major businesses in Sakhalin, so it's not completely green there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Just one thing about
coal. Sure.
Just wait till the low carbon strategy gets public. I think you'll be surprised because it's published the Russian fuel balance, and you'll get surprised by the role of coal.
Well, this is what I was going to come to this question right now, actually, because Oksana Antonenko has asked this question. It's the topical question, of course, and Oksana asks, can you comment on what Russia wants to achieve at COP26? What's a good outcome for Russia, and can Russia support reductions in energy subsidies connected to that? Go for it, Vladimir, and then Anna.
Well, as I said, Russia will be trying to reduce not just carbon emissions, but by sort of increasing the role of carbon sinks in this country. They will be reducing carbon emissions in industrial process, in the housing sector, in transport. So I think we will see efforts on all fronts. And I said, coal is an area of concern for the government, and I've already heard a lot of discussions on what to do with coal-producing regions. But what I can tell you is that Russia realizes that the role of coal will be going down, and Russia will have to live with that. And again, as part of a World Bank team, which at one point worked on sort of project to move people from Russia's north, because again, for instance, coal mines were closed in Vorkuta. I can tell you that the government have some capacity to do that. I mean, that will be addressed as regional issues, not climate issues, but I think it will be addressed.
Anna, what's your view? I mean, obviously Vladimir Putin's non-appearance, people are talking about that as saying Russia's not really serious, but maybe that's just sort of, the headline, and maybe there's more to it than that, perhaps. What do you think Russia needs to get out of COP26, perhaps?
Well, normally Russia wants its moment in the spotlight, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case again. I call this window dressing, whether it's fair or not at this point, but that Russia announces something which might not always be so very well backed by real policy measures before COPs, and maybe wants to show that something's happening, but the track record on the implementation side has been problematic. So I would be surprised if Russia's approach this time would be somehow completely different.
Okay.
What comes to the coal sector and energy subsidies, of course, the coal sector is still indirectly subsidized in Russia very heavily. It is actually contributing very little to the GDP. So most of the money that is made is also spent in keeping the sector going, probably for social reasons. We just published a report about this with climate strategies a couple of weeks ago, and had an event about this, so one can find also that recording if this is an interesting topic and considering further work. Also on this topic, the coal issue, it's great if it's been mentioned as a climate policy, but there's very strong lobby still in Russia pushing for coal exports. And then one can ask how credible is the country's climate policy if it's still planning to continue exporting coal as much and as long as possible.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to link a couple of questions here. Again, as I say, I'm not doing this in order anyway, but Bobo Low asks, what has prompted this Damascene conversion of Putin and those around him? In other words, why the change? Where has the urgency come from? And maybe to link it to Joshua Bean's question, because Joshua says there's been reports of Russia warming at approximately 2 times faster than that of most of the world, to say nothing of the record-breaking forest fires in Siberia, etc. So he's asking, what effect has this had on public opinion? And do you expect public opinion to be a driver of further Russian action on climate change? Can I go to you, Anna, first, just for the sake of difference, in terms of public opinion, and what do you think has inspired this, at least a rhetorical change in Russia as well?
It's of course also always very difficult to tell what has spurred even rhetorical change, which is kind of as significant as this. But I would think that the EU CBAM would have worked here to some extent, because this is the first time really that Russia had to face the reality of paying for emitting greenhouse gases. So far, Russia has been able to take business as usual commitments on international level, and now the EU has really pushed Russia to do something in the near future, which can be seen as an economic threat to some sectors. Maybe that is one element. Maybe also the US presidency is, it is more sort of pro climate mitigation than one could say of the previous one. So normally that has some minor impact to what kind of rhetoric Moscow uses. But of course, it's not the only reason. Maybe also the kind of need for economic diversification is seen. There is the international low carbon trend, decarbonization trend going on, and Russia is dependent on fossil fuels. Russian economy is dependent on that. So it's quite clear that can't go on forever, is as independent of what Russia would want to do. About public opinion, I think there's been some change, but I'm not a great expert on that, of the very latest. But then one can ask, how significant is the public opinion in Russian policy formulation? Probably not very. maybe Vladimir has more to say to that.
Okay, Vladimir, so why the change? Why the urgency? And what about public opinion? Is that having any effect?
Starting from the end, I don't see any change in the public opinion. I see, as I've mentioned, some change in opinion of the stakeholders at the government level. And actually, my agency, Russian Energy Agency, has published a joint report with the Center for Strategic Research earlier this year, which addresses climate agenda for Russia. And one of suggestions there is actually to develop sort of measures to increase sort of knowledge of climate issues among general public, similar to sort of financial learnings supported by the International Monetary Fund. So it is an issue. The people in the government realize that, yeah, most of the public still doesn't give a damn about this. Coming to,
but does it believe? Sorry, it doesn't give a damn. Does it believe it?
By 2 degrees and more. I've been there. So. But coming to sort of real drivers of this change, CBAM is one of them. I've admitted that. But also, I think, again, I keep mentioning this interview by Andrei Belousov. If you look there, basically he says, you know, I think at this level, that's the first time that I see admission of this, that the current sort of economic model has almost come to its limits. So we can't ensure required rates of economic growth with the old model, and energy transition gives us a chance to modernize Russian economy and to support high economic growth. So again, I mean, sort of this is not a pusher, that's a puller of the energy transition. And apart from Andrei Belousov, I hear this view from some other pretty influential people in the president office, in the government. So I think that realization that, well, the world is changing and Russia might benefit from that is one of the drivers. But I agree that CBAM has been a trigger of this change in attitude. And speaking of CBAM, I think the Russian government position on it is pretty clear. Russian companies should not pay to the EU budget. They should pay to either Russian budget or invest in Russia. Both are sort of approved by the current proposal on CBAM as measures of reducing carbon footprint and hence payment to the EU budget.
Thanks, Vladimir. Can I just push you on one thing there, because it was Joshua's question again, but I wanted to ask, very similar. You say the public does not give a damn, and I totally believe that. Is there at least an understanding of, do they believe in it, or is it some conspiracy theory that that man is causing climate change, or is sort of what I'm asking is, do people believe the science in general, or is that not?
Well,
this the case?
Again, as I said, many people. I still see publications by members of the Russian Academy of Sciences, including president of the academy, who says, this anthropogenic theory of climate change is not completely valid. So there are again, you've heard. So again, so the educated part of public opinion is still sort of split in half on that.
Interesting.
But what I'm trying to say is that I see less and less of these old style attitudes among the government officers. And that's very interesting. Interesting. Because I talk to mid-level, and I'm not saying that they have all changed their mind because the president said that you have to. Here, sort of old style opinions, but most of them have been sort of trying to use this for developing their lines of business, their lines of regulations, and actually their career.
Sure. Thanks very much for elaborating on that, Vladimir. I'm going to go to Yana Zabanova now at IASS in Potsdam. She is asking, she says that at Russian Energy Week, Pavel Sorokin at Minenergo mentioned Russia's plans to massively develop CCUs. Could you give us some information on that? Who would be the key companies, not just Gazpromneft, but maybe some others too, who might that be? And what cooperation with foreign partners could be possible in this particular area?
Okay, well, as you perhaps know, there are just 29 working CCUS projects on this planet. And there is none in Russia yet. I know one company in Perm, which has already invested money in that, and they are buying equipment from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And that's the first case of this. What has been mentioned in the question, Gazprom Neft case, it's not in Russia, it's in Serbia. So I wouldn't count this as sort of as part of Russian policy on CCUS, but I think we might see some developments on this front. The problem is actually economic. It is a question for Russia. Actually, it is sort of a real question. Does it make sense to add CCUS to existing thermal generating capacity or build new renewables capacity? That's an economic issue. And I know that people have started to not just think, but to actually calculate what is actually more beneficial to Russia. But again, this boils down to a question of the cost of these technologies. Why we have only 29 projects around the world? Because they're expensive. Mm-hmm. Actually, just 2 years ago, nobody believed that CCS was this is changing. But cost of renewables also goes down. So that's a real competition. What I can mention in this respect, though, is that at one point, some people in Russia got encouraged that the world would have to bury CO2 somewhere. And Russia is a great sink for CO2, given sort of old gas fields and other subsoil resources. But economics doesn't make sense for this.
Understood. So, Anna? Sorry. I thought you, yeah, Anna, please. Anything to add?
And I completely agree. Vladimir said it all. I mean, there are so many other cheaper opportunities for Russia to reduce emissions and improve the energy system that CCU is. I think it is something that gets mentioned because most other countries mention it, but I don't think it would be an economically really viable option.
Good. Let's move on. There's a question from Maria Shagina, who's a well-known sanctions expert in Austria, I believe. Maria says that at the Russian Energy Week recently, when Vladimir Putin called for constructive cooperation, in quotes, to tackle climate change issues and Western sanctions should not hinder such cooperation, he said. While the existing sanctions don't target green technology per se, where could you see a spillover effects from the current sanctions, which could affect Russia's energy transition? So the effect of sanctions, Vladimir, please.
One thing which is affected by sanctions is Nord Stream 2. And people in the government keep saying that Nord Stream 2 can be used for exporting hydrogen. People in Europe admit that Europe will have to import some hydrogen. So again, that's at least one thing with respect to sanctions. What else he had in mind, I don't know.
Anna, anything on the effect of sanctions?
I agree. I can't really put my finger on it. What it could be like concrete, but of course the general relations that maybe the EU doesn't speak so much with Russia in such a constructive level because of these sanctions and the background it provides.
Okay. Thanks. Right, over to Katya Yefimova. Hi, Katya, at the Oxford Energy Institute. Katya's got a CBAM question. So she says that CBAM is understood to be a violation of WTO law and estimated to result in significant losses for certain Russian exports. Do you reckon Russia will fight it via the WTO? Anna, first. Mixing it up again.
Good question. There are different legal opinions about this. I've also got legal opinions that the EU has some paths to get this through the WTO rules. But of course, the Russian companies probably will have to get prepared for CBAM anyway, because if it does get through, then it would not be good to be unprepared. Very hard to tell if Russia would, with all this other very positive rhetoric, would Russia really then go and challenge it in the WTO? Maybe. But Vladimir maybe has more information about this.
Yes, especially considering you mentioned that, Vladimir, that Russia could profit from CBAM, in fact. So, yeah, considering what Katya has to say here.
Well, as a certified trade economist, which was my role at the World Bank, I have to tell you that I see poor grounds for trying to challenge CBAM in WTO.
Right.
I'm not saying that Russia will not try to do that, but I think more and more people in the government, and actually I advise them of that, see low chances of winning on this. And in any case, EU can easily trigger an environmental clause which would exclude CBAM from WTO disputes. Again,
okay.
Recently read an opinion by the American judge to WTO, and he thinks that there are a couple of areas where EU CBAM can be challenged, but he himself provides sort of an advice how to tackle with that. So, I mean, in the sort of, in a nutshell, I don't see any chance of CBAM being sort of opposed, successfully opposed at WTO.
In which case, to Indra Overland's question just now, I mean, could Russia see CBAM as an opportunity to forge a new partnership with the EU, or at least to break free from the long-term negative trend? I mean, is it an opportunity for Russia? I mean, I suppose you've answered this to an extent, Vladimir, but if it's not going to oppose it, I mean, I guess that's what you did say. You said Russia could profit by it, and therefore it's an opportunity for a new partnership.
Well, again, I see some eagerness on the Russian side to work with Europe on these issues. In the past, I belonged to the EU-Russia energy dialogue. Well, I see some people who also were part of this. And of course, it died away back in 2014, but then there have been some efforts to revive it in one or another shape. I've heard some ideas from the German side, but basically when I tested these ideas at my own agency, they just said, fine, I mean, we would be a platform for this dialogue if Europe is serious on collaborating with us on climate change and energy transition.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on from next one from Jelle Plantenberg, please. So Vladimir, Anna, Jelle says that Anna mentioned the role of forests and their potential importance in contributing to GHG reduction efforts. He says that some Russian oil companies have also emphasized its importance as well. Rosneft, for example. What are you seeing in the recent strategy and policy developments, for instance, in potential trading schemes? Asks Jelle.
Yeah, Russian companies would like to have forest projects as part of their climate project portfolio, but they all realize that there will be problems with international certification of these projects and acknowledgement of these projects on, for instance, European side. So I think that's a task for people like Anatoly Chubais, who is the presidential envoy on cooperation, on dialogue with the West on this agenda, on sort of making international efforts to agree on sort of unified standards for forest projects, to make them part of the approved climate project portfolio.
Thanks. Anna, do you see the Rosnefts of this world as really, I mean, as doing anything independently, or would they have to be pushed? Do they jump, or will they be pushed?
Well, I'm not sure about Rosneft.
Yeah.
It's normally Rosneft comes in the end of the queue when it comes to climate.
Sure.
If I may, I would add one thing. You know, I've mentioned that the government works on 4 options for carbon taxation or carbon pricing. And one of them is actually, I don't know if you're aware of this effort, but Russia has a strategy for developing best available technologies. Sort of industry modernization efforts supported by the government. They develop long lists of technologies which are considered best available technologies, and actually they force companies to implement this, also to change their production process to implement these technologies. And actually, these technologies, this effort already has limits on emissions, not greenhouse emissions, but on various staff emissions. And if companies do not implement these technologies and exceed their limits, they're penalized. And what the government is currently discussing is let's just add greenhouse emissions to this list and make Russian companies invest in modernization of their production process. As far as I'm concerned, that is the most stringent way to approach it, because basically then forest projects go away. No company would be interested in investing in forest projects if the only thing they're penalized for is basically their own production process. So let's see what type of carbon taxes or carbon prices the Russian government will decide on, and then we'll see what happens to forest projects.
Anna, you were going to say something. Sorry. Yeah,
I just wanted to add on both the forest issue, the projects, as well as what Indra was asking about the CBAM and like a potential like cooperation area for EU and Russia. Verification of both the sort of activities by the Russian companies to prove at CBAM that something has really happened, is not double counted, so forth, and on forest projects that they're really permanent projects. That verification issue is difficult technically, and it's going to be difficult because there's lack of trust. We saw some sort of bad examples under the joint implementation scheme under the Kyoto Protocol, where the EU had to sort of cave in to some extent, hoping to buy projects and emitting allowances from Russia, and it didn't quite work out that way.
Okay, thanks. Ladies and gents, I think actually, Jelle, in fact, whilst we're on your question, you've asked a second part question, but it's actually quite a complex one. Could I bring you in, Jelle, to ask your part two of your question on CCS? Yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks also for the comments on the forest projects. It's very, very helpful. So on CCS, I just had one sort of follow-up question on that, and that's mostly because of the business model. So you could look at CCS as a way to extend sort of classical hydrocarbon-based projects, right? So if you would export, let's say, either any hydrocarbon, but let's say LNG, that would maybe be the easiest example, and then you import back the CO2 that was generated in maybe a CCGT or something like that, maybe in Japan, for instance. So, and if you would then store that CO2, it's a way to extend this classic energy export scheme that has been working so well for a long time. And in my view, it's a very different proposition than, for instance, domestic power generation using RES, using wind technology or anything else. So that actually doesn't, I think a straight comparison between the two, as was in the previous answer done, is maybe not the best way to look at that. I'm keen to hear your views on that.
Thanks, Jelle. Anna first, perhaps?
That's a very complex question in a way.
I didn't ask it.
But yeah, I know you didn't. I would just say that the Russian energy sector, and for instance, what comes to combustion coal domestically, is that capacity is on average 53 years old. And that's any slightly bigger capacity, over 25 megawatts. And that will have to be replaced in any case. So I think that's going to be some kind of natural development taking place. And I think it's much more likely there also that as gasification has been, spreading around Russia more over those last 50 years, there will be more availability of gas. And I just think that's a sort of more natural thing to do than try to invest in something as expensive as CCUS.
So
the Russian market is not such. But yeah, sorry, go on. Do specify.
I do very much agree with that, right? So I think for domestic power generation, I agree CCS likely doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily. I would see it linked to export schemes more, either by exporting hydrocarbons and importing CO2 again for storage. That's one option. the other option could be, for instance, through hydrogen. So indeed, if you create blue hydrogen and maybe exports through Nord Stream 2 or some other scheme, and you store the CO2, right? Then those are ways to export energy, which is difficult if you just create power, right? So exporting power is just limited because of the distances there. So it's a way to maybe still have an export economy based on hydrocarbons, or at least extend the life of such a pillar.
Can I just add a little bit?
Yep.
Then we'll
Yeah, and then
turn to
Vladimir. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Just very briefly. Yes, I think the permanence issue and the verification, can we really trust a Russian CO2 storage, would be a question there. And plus, look at the energy prices now. We have a slightly higher gas price. Would you really think that, like, the EU customers would be happy to pay for the CCUS price in addition to that? Maybe over time, but I don't think that on any short or midterm it would still be quite expensive.
Sure. Thank you. Vladimir, over to you on CCS.
Again, we are going back to economics of CCUS. If economics of CCUS works on the western end of Russian export routes, why to bother to move CO2 back to Russia? I mean, Europe has enough of its own capacity to borrow CO2. Why to incur more cost on moving this back to Russia? So again, I agree with Anna that economics will be crucial. At the moment, economics doesn't.
Well, that's good, because the next and actually last question I have so far, so there's room for a couple more if anyone wants to add any more, is from Bobo, and it's on the economics of it as well. But Bobo's second question says that it's been said that the energy strategy 2035 and coal strategy 2035 will be amended, but in reality it'd have to be fundamentally transformed. Yes, the energy strategy 2035 envisages a 50% increase in gas production by 2035. So how can this be squared with a net zero commitment by 2060? And why would Moscow voluntarily give up one of Russia's major sources of economic strength and geopolitical influence? It doesn't seem worth it, looking at Russia's current ambitions, beyond the energy sphere, if you like. Vladimir, if I may, sorry, I should have directed it to you first of all, if I may.
Oh, Russia, as I said, people in the Russian government have realized that they can't impose hydrocarbons on the vote if the vote doesn't want hydrocarbons. That's as simple as that. Again, if you look at the government strategy, Belarus interview, they all admit that Russia will have to live with low export revenues. They realize that Russia will not be able to export as much oil and perhaps natural gas as that they should have.
Point taken, but to a fundamental point of Bobo's question, how do you reconcile 50% increase in gas production by 2035 and the net zero commitment by 2060? How do you reconcile those two things?
The role of gas in energy transition is an open question, but when I was at BP, we produced a report which showed that gas consumption in the world will grow, even in a rapid transition scenario. It will grow, then it will go down, but only to the level of 2018, say. So the Russia has the room as the largest natural gas owner on this planet, has a room to export this gas. Again, if CCUS works on important side, fine. I mean, that's an issue, not Russia, but everybody will have to solve as part of energy transition. What technology works better?
So do you think it'll meet the net 2060 commitment, net zero commitment?
Well, yeah, I think it might. Again, the real question to me is how much will be achieved by genuine reduction in energy intensity and carbon intensity of Russian economy, and how much Russia will try to achieve by increasing carbon sink.
Okay. Anna, you and I have spoken about this, the fact that it doesn't seem to quite make sense. Russia's economic ambition and its the trends and the reality imposed by climate change as well. How do you reconcile the two, or how do you think Russia doesn't it? Is it one of those sort of inevitable contradictions in Russia, perhaps?
How would you do it? With difficulty. I would thank Bobo for summarizing very well why I kind of feel skeptical about this, and I consider this current rhetoric as with a big question mark. Indeed, I mean, this would require a major economic restructuring of the Russian economy. I don't think that the Russian government is going to give up a milking cow, at least on short and mid-term. Surely there'll be less demand for coal. There's going to be maybe less demand for other fossil fuels over time, but at least the Russian coal sector and the political leadership still this year seem to be thinking that the coal will be exported as long as there's somebody who wants to buy it. And I would remind still, when we talk about how there are now plans to set up a carbon price in Russia and so on, still this summer, the industry lobby rejected a carbon price, rejected emissions trading scheme in Russia. These things, they don't change overnight. Of course, there have been very positive developments, but I don't think this is a done deal. Thanks.
Got it. Very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Oksana Antonienko has saved me again with possibly a final question. Also very topical, actually, like Bobo's. In fact, how do you see the current gas crisis influencing the pace of energy transition? Some commentators believe that Russia is trying to teach the EU a lesson by restricting gas exports, and demonstrate the current green energy transition plans are too ambitious. Yeah, it doesn't get more topical than that. Anna first, please.
Very briefly, of course, this, to some, it looks like we should try to be friends with Russia in order to get gas cheaper. But to others, like to our Finnish Prime Minister, it shows itself in a different light. This is a reason to get rid of the fossil fuels because we are dependent on suppliers which might come up with political increases of price in order to make a point.
Ah, right. Vladimir, the current gas crisis. Obviously, sometimes Vladimir Putin is presented as a bogeyman here, deliberately cutting short gas supplies. Obviously, on the other side of the equation, as Mark Gallagher pointed out in the Moscow Times the other day, then quite clearly, Russia is fulfilling its contracts and doesn't need to do any more than that. What do you say, Vladimir?
Well, if you look at just at data, you'll see that LNG inputs to Europe are going down, and not from Russia, going down from the US and other parts of the world. And why is that? I mean, what's the difference between US cutting gas export to Europe and Russia actually not sufficiently increasing, because Russia did increase gas flows to Europe relative to last year. But again, I think the whole issue of the current price crisis in Europe and actually in Asia as well deserves a sort of a separate discussion. I mean, there are just too many reasons. As a person who have been following gas market quite closely for years, I don't see Russia as the key component of the current gas price hike in Europe.
Sure, that's fair. Thank you. And I think, yeah, you're right. It does need a separate discussion, and we'll definitely aim to have that one in the new year. Look, I'll take a final question from Joshua Bean here. Again, Joshua asks, is Russia taking more action on climate change likely to have a positive influence on its allies, especially in Central Asia, to reduce reliance on coal and hydrocarbons? Anna first, and then maybe finish with Vladimir, perhaps.
Wow, that was a very detailed question. I must say I'm by no means an expert on Central Asian climate policy, but I do know that there are countries like Kazakhstan which have gone further than Russia has. That's difficult to tell. I really don't have anything very detailed on this.
Okay, no problem at all. Vladimir.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, both Kazakhstan and Pakistan actually are further in energy transition than Russia, at least in ambitions, and actually not just ambitions, but investment in developing renewables. So, I mean, given that Kazakhstan is part of the same economic union with Russia, I mean, both countries will influence each other, because if, for instance, energy transition affects energy prices in one country, it will inevitably impact the other as well. So I'm pretty sure that we will see not just impact, but collaboration between these countries, because they do belong to sort of common market. After all, that's what the Eurasian Economic Union is a sort of EU in its infancy.
Thanks, Vladimir. And I've seen some excellent comments back at you from Bob Otto and from Oksana on this kind of thing. So it brings us back to the start, really, about the point about Western cooperation, and the point I sort of made originally about whether whether this was one of the very few areas where it seems, sadly, that the West can cooperate with Russia, bearing in mind the urgency of it. And to be honest with you, from what I've learned from this discussion is that the jury is still out, quite frankly. And although we've hear a lot of very positive stuff coming from the Russian Federation, more so than we've heard ever before, just in the last year, then there's still these doubts still remain, and so there's a lot more to be explored. So we'd better explore them in the future roundtables. So could I just end by thanking Anna Korpu and Vladimir Dorobensov for being very game and for answering all your questions succinctly but intelligently, as they merited, in fact. And as I say, the Russian Eurasia Program at Chatham House hasn't really done this before, which is a lapse on my part, but we'll certainly make sure we do this within a very short time period, I promise. So again, thanks once more, and see you all next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.